Chapter 9. Hyenas Among Friends. 5:26 a.m. Tuesday, December 14th, 1858. The Lamar Plantation Woodyard. Although the Ingleses were no longer able to buy and sell Africans legally, Boubacar told him about the metal cages hidden in the jungle behind the Kisika, holding African captives inside them. Sometimes they would hear the echoes of sorrowful moans in the distance, beyond what they could see from between the bars that were firmly embedded and locked on the shop windows. Boubacar said the people had been captured in tribal wars, as Sundiata himself probably had been, or they were simply snatched away from their villages by mercenaries who fought for any side that hired them for the money. The slavers randomly grabbed a few of the people they hadn't slaughtered for the same reason. Those unfortunate souls were being hidden away in the cover of the thick jungle so they could be loaded onto the waiting Nkanus when the dark came. Dugouts were camouflaged in the heavy foliage on the banks of the Nzadi, waiting for their cohorts to haul the slaves out of the jungle and transport them to Nkanus, anchored further down the river. Then those larger utility Nkanus, loaded with ivory, rubber, and other goods gathered up from all over Africa, unloaded everything into a bigger Nkanu that sailed off to a colored dot on the parchment map that was far away from Boma.
The huge Nkanus are called ships.
Then you cross one wrist over another and hooked his thumbs together to form wings with the fingers of his hands.
This is how the Ingleses and Portuguese Nkanu ships fly like birds across the sea on gigantic white Mababa Namaswa. The white wings made out of cloth are called velas by the Portuguese, and the English called them sails.
Boubacar marked their location in Boma on his map by placing a smooth green stone over it. Then his flapping bird hands came to rest on a tan portion of the map that reminded Sundiata of a chicken with its already fried drumstick trailing after it.
The ships fly on their sails here to America do Norte y do Sul, where they sell the African merchandise they carried over the oceans to the filhos dos ingleses. It is an ugly business, Cubby.
As usual, Boubacar had been precisely right. Even though Sundiata obeyed his adopted father and never went out alone, not even the savvy Boubacar would have suspected that the two local boys he had known for years, who he paid to procure goods for him at the docks and supplied their kasika with a daily delivery of dried fish and fruit, would be the ones to rob him of his cubby boy. Yet it was so. Karim and Samir, like Boubacar, were very light-skinned with eyes of green and grey. They spoke to Boubacar in the language of their fathers. Sundiata understood most of the words in Portuguese, but he also liked the challenge of puzzling out the meaning of new ones when traders came into the kasika to barter. Hiding himself out of sight behind the curtains, he'd listen to their exchanges while trying to guess what manner of exotic wares they had spread out before Boubacar on the teakwood table. Later, he'd bother his adoptive father about the words he hadn't figured out, until the merchant would smile wearily and finally write them out for Sundiata to study. Samir was the younger of the two. He might have been only 5 or 6 years older than Sundiata. He was well aware that Sundiata lived in the back of the Kisika and constantly under the watchful protection of the merchant. His older companion Karim was an angry fellow who consistently treated Samir badly. Maybe they were half-brothers or not related at all. Sundiata didn't know exactly where they originally came from, only that they worked on the docks and were the offspring of some Portuguese sailors and village women, as was Boubacar. Being half African and half Ingleses, They lived in relative safety from being abducted by slavers, since, it seemed, they had some sort of common bond and unspoken rules regarding who was for sale and who wasn't. Sometimes Samir quietly slipped past the curtain to talk to Sundiata about scenes he'd witnessed on the river. Sundiata was always careful to place the rug over the wooden door that led down to the Nzo Yang Toto. He took pity on Samir since he was always hungry, finding food and shelter wherever he could around the docks. He tried to teach him to recognize a few words in the books Boubacar loaned him, but Samir was too fidgety to sit still and learn. Samir had only one dream, and it was the single focus of his being. All he thought about or talked about was climbing onto one of them canoes he watched sail down the Nzadi to a place called Banana Point. Samir eavesdropped on the conversations of the sailors and traders passing through Boma. Their stories filled his mind with legends of a heaven where the Nzadi met the sea and beyond. The men whispered between them about the huge winged nganus anchored only a little ways off the shore. The ships were waiting to load up the slaves and goods gathered by the traders from all over Africa. Samir and Karim carefully hid between the clay pots stored next to the brothel that held palm oil to listen in on the sailors' fantastic stories about the golden lands where the winged Nganu ships finally landed. They heard the men brag about the great fortunes they'd already made and the piles of money they were going to make in the future in America. In Samir's imagination, this country was a paradise with land free for the taking, decorated in cool blue lakes, and full of delicious things to eat everywhere you looked. It was a place where any man had the chance to be a king if you chose to. Samir and Karim were convinced that their lives would be perfect in the world that waited across the water. It consumed their thoughts day and night. All a man needed was to have the courage to start the journey and the stamina to live through the difficult crossing. America do Norte was where Samir was certain he would never be hungry or be abused by the sailors for their pleasure ever again. Only 2 days before they took him, Samir had slipped past the curtain to outline the plans with Sundiata that he and Karim had made for leaving Boma. They had gained passage aboard one of the giant nkanus from America do Norte that was waiting off Banana Point. A sailor who had stopped in Boma to load up his river vessel with goods promised to ferry them down to Banana Point if they could deliver to him something that was more valuable and rare than just palm oil or snakeskins. Samir tried very hard to convince Sundiata to come along with them, reiterating the stories of the boundless riches that awaited them there. Sundiata watched Samir's vision drift off from the present moment to glimpse the treasures he believed were waiting for him in America do Norte. Sundiata agreed with Samir that his upcoming adventure would be exciting and hoped everything he wished for in that place would come true. He did his best to feign disappointment that he was not free to leave the adopted father who had saved him from death. He must stay and pay his debt if he were to be an upright Christian man. The truth was that Sundiata wanted nothing more than to know everything about the thousands of marvels safely nestled inside the reinforced walls of their trading post Kisika. Why would he choose to expose himself to the thousands of dangers his adoptive father had warned him about? Why would he face the terrors he had read about in holy books when all the wonders of the world were delivered to their kisika every day in baskets and boxes. He sent Samir on his way by wishing him sincere good luck on his travels. Lying on the cold deck of this pedal wheel Nkanu, Sundiata once again ran the details of his abduction through his mind. A rough hand was clasped over his mouth and nose as the point of a knife blade was pressed into his back. Karim navigated the stairs silently as the stunned Sundiata was swiftly dragged up and out the back door. Once away from the kisika, they crammed him inside a large woven basket, and Karim made the warning clear to him. If Sundiata made even a tiny sound, the blade against his back would pierce through his heart to end him. The finish of his happy life had fallen upon him like a reckless timber from the sky. As Sundiata was loaded onto the waiting dugout, he could only make sense of the situation as a nightmare he was dreaming. This feeling of his mind being detached from his body was familiar to him when he dreamed. He observed himself being loaded onto the craft from a vantage point located far above the basket. From then on, he drifted in and out of his skin, trying to intentionally wake himself up so he could climb the stairs to sit by Boubacar's bed, as he often had done when he had nightmares. But the prickly, damp vines that stunk of hot fish scalded him with the reality that he was not on his mat in the cool basement surrounded by the safety he had come to take for granted. He prayed as he'd never done before, with more focus and more contriteness. He beseeched Jesu to wake up and come with his mother Maria to help him devise some sort of plan for escape. When daylight finally began to stream through the cracks in the basket, the lid was removed. A bearded man, with a hat made from the hide of a crocodile, stared down at Sundiata. Then he roughly dragged him up by the neck of his sleeping shirt, as if he weighed no more than a cat. The pirate's beard was matted against his head and appeared to be some form of fungus or mold clinging to his scarred face. He spun Sundiata toward the back of the Nkanu so he could get a good look at the faces of Karim and Salim. They were looking back at him without the support of their shoulders. Their heads had been hacked from their bodies and propped up on what was left of their necks, with expressions that shot both stupid surprise and complete regret back at Sundiata. Numbed to his core by that impossible sight, time came to an end for Sundiata. His eyelids were paralyzed as he watched the crocodile skin hat man lob Samir's head over the side of the Nkanu like it was no more than a bad coconut. Then he scrambled across the deck to catch Karim's lifeless head as it rolled towards Sundiata before launching it into the water to keep Samir company. After that, Sundiata acknowledged there were divisions between dark and light, between terror and relief, sickness and hunger, thirst and death. Yet all the sensations that had once been distinct were shredded. In the shelter of Boubacar's shop, he was whole. Now he was torn into pieces, and those scraps floated along on one ceaseless stream of water that delivered the small Nkanus to the big ones. His mind wriggled around in this pocket of his memory over and over, because inside there, he still believed, there existed a crevice where he would grow to be a man under the protection of Boubacar. He would still learn the languages his adoptive father so effortlessly juggled, switching from the guttural patois of the grizzled traders to the sharp tongue clicks of the finely dressed wives of tribal chiefs. He would once again watch as their rainbow-colored turbans, wrapped so high that they brushed the lintel when they stepped through the shop door, bobbed while they prattled and gossiped. He would still discover the value of every single item on every shelf and in every box. He would know which merchandise was desired by whom before they even knew themselves. He would be the one to watch over Boubacar as he grew older. He would protect him, and they would piece together the stories of the world the old man had heard from all the traders who traveled from the colored dots on the big map on the table. Sundiata's entire universe still existed inside Boubacar's mud walls. He had never wished for anything more than the life he was already living. Never imagined leaving the man he loved, maybe even more than his real father. Why hadn't the Virgin warned him before Samir and Karim carried him off? He could have called out to Boubacar if he'd only had a moment's warning. He wished his head had been tossed over the side into the Nzadi River with those of Samir and Karim. It turned out they had been the fortunate ones, for this most surely was the hell for sinners Father Mateo warned him about. Better to be ahead, eternally in search of your body, than writhing between the half-dead, locked in chains, slick with vomit and shit, in the steamy guts of a winged Nkanu ship. And now waiting, as the frost crawled upon your skin, to find out what new torments his unrecognized sins had in store for him. Perhaps Samir and Karim would be waiting to meet him when he reached the end of the water. Maybe they were already crucified on a wooden cross. Surely they'd committed even worse sins than Sundiata ever had when they stole him away from Boubacar. They had to bear the responsibility of sentencing an old man to a lonely death, with no wife or son to care for him. Imagining Boubacar dying alone was almost worse than the weeks of torture the boy had endured.
We're all we've got, my cub.
Boubacar would say as he lay himself down on his bed of old tapestry at the end of the day.
But that is more than enough. Go on to bed. Fall asleep with the name of the Virgin on your lips, and we will meet again in the morning.
Some combination of those were his final words to Sundiata each night before the boy would wander through the darkness of the shop, finally free to run his hands over the shapes of the objects displayed for sale on the wooden shelves. Each night, he double-checked every iron lock on the windows and both doors before going down the steps into the Ntoto. His mat was nestled in between the pots filled with the fine, expensive oils like frankincense, and under a hanging shelf where the delicate spices that couldn't stand the heat were tied in bundles. Their mingled scent signaled the smell of sleep to him. Samir and Karim were already hiding back there, in the darkness, waiting for him to finish saying his prayers and drift off. He could never figure out when they'd slipped into the Kisika, but they must have lain in wait for many hours. Sundiata was lost in wondering if his kidnappers must first retrieve their heads before they could stop swimming around and move on to a proper hell when the paddle wheel slowed down to a stop. The mumbles of the captives lying close to him lightly ruffled throughout the dark cabin and alerted him. They stole any opportunity to stretch or change positions slightly while the white bazungus were otherwise occupied with the workings of the vessel. When this kind of nkanu stopped, wood was brought aboard to be burned by fires of the rotating mechanism that scooped the river water through it. In some way, the smoke fed the paddle wheels, moving the nkanu forward. Sundiata had watched closely as two men, one white and one brown, fed wood into a box that glowed orange with the heat of the fires. Whenever the wheels stopped turning completely, the white Bazungu walked between the Africans on the deck with their guns out of their belts and held in their hands. Any slight movement or sound made by one of the many captives surrounding him in the dark resulted in broken fingers or toes. When the wheel was turning again, the screams would be covered up by the slap, slap sound of the paddles. The slaves were repeatedly warned to lay as close to the floor as possible, since they boarded this vessel from the beach, where they'd been put out of the big winged Nkanu. Inside the belly of that ship, Sundiata had been iron-roped to a man who had cried for a long time before he finally stopped. Sundiata counted the passing of the days and nights by the rhythm of the poor man's sobs. His heart even began to beat along in time with the cadence of his bawling. Sundiata had tried to comfort him, but his response came back in a language so foreign that there was no way to figure out what he was saying. It wasn't until the Bazungas unshackled them to lead them up from inside the belly of the winged Nkanu and into the light that he finally got a good look at the man's face. Burned onto his cheek was a mark that resembled bird wings. All his teeth were filed to a point like those of a cat. Even though he was certain his chainmate was a full-grown man, he stood no taller than Sundiata was at 10 years old. The boy, along with a group of about 50 other kidnapped Africans, saw the outside expanse in which the winged Nkanu was flying. In every direction was blue water that washed up into blue sky until Sundiata believed the ship was floating inside a gigantic blue bottle. This realization shattered the stories the priest told him about the fires of hell. Now he knew those came later. All Father Mateo had gotten right was the stifling, dead air inside the ship, where they all would soon be chained to the walls again. Close enough, Father Mateo. Up on the outside deck, when his sobbing chainmate clamped his lips closed and refused to eat, the Bazungu put a metal funnel into his mouth. They forced mashed rice into his throat until he swallowed. It was no use, though. Almost as quickly as it had gone in, it came spewing out again, causing the poor fellow to start wailing once more. Another captive tried to calm him by patting him firmly on the back, but two of the white Bazungu grabbed the sad man's elbows, dragged him to the edge of the craft, and threw him over the side, without another word between them. Every single African who witnessed this event, up in the blue light, surrounded by blue water, ate anything that was put before them. Not a one of them cared to find out what greater horror might await the soul who was tossed over the edge of the giant winged Nkanu ship. This paddle-wheel vessel was not moving, and there was no wood being loaded onto it. This was a different kind of stop than all the others along this river they'd been traveling for the past 2 days. Sundiata sensed the tension of the people he had lying all around him. When they had been taken off the winged Nkanu in the night, where the sea ended in a river of sand, they'd been allowed to walk without chain ropes and sit next to a fire pit. That was the first time, and the last time, Sundiata felt a sprig of hope. Maybe the stories Samir had told him about the land across the great water being a promised land for those strong enough to survive the perils of the journey to the other side might be true. Maybe Samir and Karim had been trying to take him along with them as a friend, but they'd been killed for spilling the secret. There were holes in this explanation, but perhaps the worst was over. He'd passed the test. The Africans had been allowed to wash the filth from their bodies with clean water. A white medicine bazungu looked in his mouth, his ears, his eyes, and all over his body, and after being naked for months, they were given garments made out of rough cloth to cover themselves. Sundiata started to believe the unspeakable torments were over. His hair had grown back after being shaved off by the crocodile hat pirate on his dirty Nkanu. That had happened right before the boy was tied by a rope, hoisted up on the deck of the winged ship, and burned by a hot metal stick on his back. Maybe the fact that he survived at all was evidence that he'd received some reward in this foreign place. On that sandy island, several African men approached in a wagon filled with unshucked corn and dumped it all out on the ground. It was the most food they'd seen since they'd been swallowed up by the ship at Banana Point. Several of the captives heard one of the African men by the wagon speaking their home language. They ran to him, kneeling and crying. Sundiata had no idea what he said to them. It was not Portuguese, or Kiboma, or Kikongo. They seemed to calm down a little bit as he spoke to them. Eating his fill of the corn, Sundiata had even started to think he might be able to send for Boubacar, although he knew the old man wouldn't survive the torturous passage, winged ship flying through the blue bottle world. If he discovered he had to go back to Africa the same way he got to America to get Boubacar, Sundiata decided he would find a way to kill himself as soon as possible. That is, if he wasn't already dead. Drifting out of the present was a recent skill Sundiata had honed to the point of being an expert. He learned how to float his mind back across the sea and back up the Nzadi River to the banks of Boma. He would use the roots poking out of the mud to hoist himself up until he saw the village, and run until he was through the doors of the shop. He wouldn't care who saw him or if fancy women were shocked to see a naked boy streak past them. Boubacar would stop whatever bargaining he was in the midst of to embrace Sundiata. With tears streaming down his face, he would wrap the boy in the bright red and yellow fabric lying folded by the window as he thanked Jesus and the Virgin for the safe return of his little lion boy. A kick to his ribs brought him back to his current fate. It was not as hard a kick as had been delivered to his body before by the Bazungus, but it carried enough force to drag him out of the bliss of Boubacar's embrace. Sundiata realized that most of the other Africans were up on their feet, although in the light of the oil lamp swinging back and forth in the hands of the fire-feeding man, he saw about a dozen bodies were still lying, motionless on the deck. One of them was a girl about his age named Sazi, who appeared to have no life in her. Next to her was a tall boy Sundiata had tried to befriend, but because the fellow never made any sound, they had devised a language of hand signs to talk to each other. Neither of them roused. Sundiata decided to go to where they were lying, using a sideways maneuver that appeared to the Bazungas as if he was following their commands, while he was actually inching toward the motionless children. The Bazungus barked sharp words at the captives as they pushed the frightened people toward the edge of the wheeled Nkanu. It was black dark in the distance beyond, but the voices of Englishmen came echoing back in response. When he reached the place where Sazi lay, Sundiata could tell she was unconscious. Inside this white Inglese's prison Nkanu hell, having a body that didn't move meant even if the soul wasn't gone from it yet, or not, it was vanished from sight. Sundiata crouched down to pick the girl up. He felt she was hot with fever. She was so light that when he lifted her in his arms, She weighed no more than a basket of grain he'd often brought up from their Nzoya Ndoto in the Kisika. Her skin warmed Sundiata's bare arms. His silent friend opened his eyes to a squint. Sundiata motioned with his head for the boy to pull up and lean on him too. Together, they melted into the larger group now being herded toward the darkness at the edge of the vessel.